Hi, this is Alex from PHP Academy and welcome to this CSS tutorial on the CSS display property. Now in this tutorial we're going to be looking at three of the possible values that this property can take. We're not going to be going through them all because a lot of them are really useless for creating a site design, and a lot of the table properties to do with tables are relatively useless. So we're just going to be looking at the three that will crop up the most, so just to save a bit of time. Okay, so first of all, what is the display property, and what are these values that it can take? Well, when we create elements in CSS, they take on different display types by default, and then we can modify these display types to get things to work and move and give them heights and widths and just float differently on the page or display differently on the page. So I'm going to jump in and give you a few examples. Now we're going to be looking at inline, inline block and block. So you've got inline block, which you can probably guess is a combination of inline and block, and then we've got block. So I'm going to give you a few examples and then we'll talk through how these differ, and also we'll start to modify some inline elements and make them block and make them inline, for example. Okay, so the first one we're going to look at is links. So let's go ahead and just create a link. I'm going to call this link 1, and I'm just going to put a hash for the href. I'm going to go ahead and just duplicate this down and call it link 2. Now when we go ahead and open up our browser and refresh, you can see that the elements have sat next to each other. So we've got the link 1 here and the link 1 too. They've sat next to each other. Now it really helps if we use the element inspector in Chrome, or if you're using Firefox, use Firebug, just to see sort of how these look. And you can see that at the moment they are in line with each other. So they're sat next to each other essentially. We haven't done anything to them. We've just put them underneath each other, but they've automatically sat next to each other. Now what would happen if I say put a div around each one of these? I'm not going to give it a class or an ID. I'm just going to go ahead and put a div around each one. Now we assume now that the anchor tags, so the A tags, have automatically been given a display type of inline. Now when I wrap a div around each one, you'll see that we get a slightly different result, and you see that they are pushed down under one another. So you can now see that when I hover over each div, the blue area that contains this, or the contents of this div, are spanning the whole width of the page, and that means that these are block elements. Nothing can sit next to them. They take up as much room as you specify, or if you don't specify it, they're going to take up the whole width of the container element. At the moment that's body. So we can modify that obviously using the display property, and we can do that using CSS, because obviously this is CSS that we're talking about. So the first thing we're going to go ahead and do is just modify these divs here and make them display inline, and then we're going to remove them and we're going to make some modifications to the links that are by default inline. And you might be wondering, why is all this useful? Well, obviously when you're creating elements you might need to modify them. Inline elements by default, you can't specify heights and things like that. It's a bit tricky, so we need to modify the display type before we start to give classes different properties and things like that. So let's go ahead and give a class name to both these divs. Now unimaginatively I'm going to call them I'm just going to call this class inline. Probably not the best idea, depends on what they're for. And in my primary.css style sheet, which I've got included into my page, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create the inline selector. And inside here we're going to go and say display inline. Inline. So now what we've done is we've modified the default behavior of a div, and we've modified it from the original display block. You can see that that's under the user agent style sheet. It's by default a block display. And when we refresh, you can see that now this class of inline has created the display to be inline, which has overridden the original block. So now we've got the two links that are sat next to each other. So this is useful if you did want to contain some links or images or whatever you wanted to contain within a div. You could display them inline. Okay, so now that we've looked at divs which have a default of block, and we've looked at links which have a default of inline, now let's go ahead and take a look at inline block and see how this differs. Now let me just first of all go ahead and change the background color of this inline class to black, and I'll set the color to white just so we can see what we're dealing with. And let's go ahead and refresh. Okay, so you can see that we've got no gap between it. They're sort of inline now, and they've pushed against each other on the same line. Let's go ahead and this is because we've got links within our div. If we just shove important on the end there, which is bad practice, we should be styling our anchor tags as well. But I'm just gonna override that. Oh no, it's because they're. Never mind. Let's get rid of that. It's because they're visited and complicated. Okay, so now that we've got our links within here, what we can do is we can go ahead and we can set a height. So I'll say 100 pixels, and I'll set a width of 200 pixels. So when I go and refresh, you can see that nothing's happened. Okay, now we've got the property display inline now. So now is a good chance to give the dramatic explanation, and this is how things change with inline block. Now inline blocks are elements that display inline, but they take on the same they give an addition the same behavior of a block element. So if we say inline block, and this is separated by a hyphen, so it's inline hyphen block, when we go over to our style sheet, you'll see that the properties that haven't taken effect, like this here, let's just go ahead and get rid of color, this here, will actually be taken into account, because inline elements, we can't actually specify the height and width here. So let's go ahead and refresh, and you see that now we've styled them as display inline block. We've got block elements that are now displayed inline. So if we had these just as blocks, they'd look the same, but they wouldn't be displayed on the same line. So in this tutorial, we've looked at displaying elements as blocks, and divs, for example, are a default display block. We've looked at inline, for example, things like anchor tags. We've also got span tags, which are by default inline. And then we've taken a look at the advantage we can get of using inline block. Now, as I said before at the start of the tutorial, there are others, so you can go ahead and look them up, but it's likely that when you're designing a site, you're not going to need them or come across them unless you're dealing with things like tables. So that's a tutorial on the display property.